Hello you wonderful people, welcome. My name's Ben Deckerai and today we're going to be installing Gatsby and the brand new Auth0 React SDK. A little over 24 hours ago, Auth0 released a brand new SDK specifically for React. Until now, React and Gatsby developers and any single-page app developers would use the single-page app SDK and have to write a little bit of glue code. There are guides on the web on how to do that, but this new React SDK takes a lot of the work off our shoulders. Let's jump in, create a new React app, and see where we go from there. Using the Gatsby command line tool, we're going to create a new project and we're going to call it Hoist. This is going to take a little while to install all the stuff in the background, so I'm just going to click fast forward and we'll get through this quickly. And we're done. That took only a couple of minutes. A lot faster for you. Let's go in here. So we're being told now to go into the Hoist directory and then to run Gatsby develop. I'm not going to run Gatsby develop at this point. Let's open up VS Code and we'll do it from inside here. So we've got our standard Gatsby app on the left here. If we open up a terminal down here, we'll run Gatsby develop. And this allows us to see the error messages within the environment that we're writing the code. If we open this up in a browser now, we can see our default starter. So, like I mentioned, the project that we're working on is Hoist, and I already have a website for that I've been working on. You might have seen some of my Twitch streams where I've added Auth0 and Sanity CMS, the headless CMS, in already. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press that fast forward button again. I'm going to apply the styles that we've developed in the past to this app, and then we'll go from there. Okay, here we go. The new theme has been installed. We've got our About page, we've got our home page, we've got our login buttons, which currently link to a dialog alert. Both of them currently do the same thing. We've got our features down here, and we've got a common footer. Let's have a look at how to integrate the login buttons with Auth0. So the first thing we want to do is jump over to Auth0 and log in so that we can inspect the tenants. Making sure up here that I'm on the Hoist tenant, I'm going to jump over to Applications. And I've created an application here already for the product that we're writing. If you're coming at this from scratch, then you just click on Create Application up there, give it a name, select Single Page Application. It gives examples down here of Angular, React, and Vue. Gatsby is also a single page application. We already have one, so I'm just going to open this up. If you're creating one from scratch, you'll default on the Quick Start tab here. So we'll jump over to there, and we'll see that we've got the 4 sample Quick Starts here. We'll select React, even though we're using Gatsby. We're going to need to make a couple of changes to the process that we follow in this guide, but the guide's going to take us pretty much as close as possible. When you first configure Auth0 for your application, there are a couple of things that you need to set up, you need to tell Auth0 about so that it can interact securely with your application. And those 3 bits of information are the callback URL, the logout URL, and the allowed web origins. The callback URL is a list of 1 or more URLs that when the user has completed their login process on the Auth0 domain, so in this case we have hoist.auth0.com is our tenant for logging in. Once our user has logged in, we want a list of at least more than one URLs that Auth0 can redirect back to. This allows us to ensure that only our application is going to get redirected to once the user has completed the login process. Logout process similarly, once the user logs out, we want to know where the user should be allowed to be sent back to. And with the allowed web origins, this tells Auth0 where people can come from in the first place to even log in. Because Gatsby runs by default on port 8000, we've got localhost port 8000 here, and if we jump up to the top and head over to the settings tab, the values here have already been added in, so we've got localhost 8000, 8000, 8000. These weren't added automatically when I created the app, I did these beforehand. For you, you would just basically paste these in. And if you're setting this up for the first time or making any changes, don't forget to head down to the bottom there and click on Save Changes. Alright, back to the Quick Start. We've configured the callback or the URLs, so the next thing to do is to install the new Auth0 React SDK. So I'll jump back over into code here. I'll stop the Gatsby development environment. And we'll just paste that in and install Auth0 React. While that's happening in the background, let's carry on through the quick start and see what the process is to configure the new SDK within our React app. Remembering that we're using Gatsby, this first step is going to have to change slightly. In React, when you render the application, there's an index.js. And in that, which is essentially the home page, is the first file that gets rendered. And in there, there's an instruction that when the React DOM is rendered, the app element here is your application, and you can wrap it. In this case, we want to wrap it in an Auth0 provider, which provides the whole application, the React application, the information required for the Auth0 SDK to be able to interact with the Auth0 servers. In this case, we're not going to be using React DOM render because that's not how Gatsby works. And we won't be editing the index.js because that's not where Gatsby stores this information. In Gatsby, we need to jump over to the Gatsby browser file here, which at the moment is blank, but it allows us to override the way that Gatsby creates the web application for the browser. So I'll just remove the comments at the top here, and then we'll grab this code, which will need to change a little. So rather than using React DOM render, what we want to do is export a method that will wrap the root element. React is automatically going to call this method and pass your application into it as the element. So if we change the app part down here to element, we're now wrapping the Gatsby application with the Auth0 provider. We don't need this part here, but we do need to return this JSX. There we go. So at the top here, you'll see we're not using app. App is a React construct, and we don't need the React DOM. So we can remove these two parts here. The Auth0 provider here is provided by the SDK. Previously, this is something we would have had to implement ourselves in order to get it working within Gatsby or React. We're specifying in here the domain and the client ID. You'll notice that because we use the Auth0 documentation, it's already pre-populated these. I don't like the idea of having these hard-coded into the file though, so we're going to move these into an environment variable file. Once you go to production, you can sort your environment variables in a more secure way. For development, we're just going to create a new file. With Gatsby, we can create a .env.development file, which will automatically parse and pull in. So we grab these two bits of information here and put them into the env file. We're going to rename this to Auth0 domain and Auth0 client ID. Now, one thing we need to be aware of with Gatsby, which is slightly different to just writing a standard React application, is Gatsby has two parts. It's got the build process at the beginning, where it can do a whole lot of stuff on a server in a trusted environment to build the static app, and then it's got Gatsby, which runs within that static application, and it's also able to do things like connect off to APIs and might need keys. In our case here, the Auth0 client ID is going to be needed by the React application, not the Gatsby application. For security purposes, Gatsby is not going to pass any environment variables through to React by default, because we could have, for example, a private key that allows us to access a content management system for the purposes of statically generating new content. We don't want that key, which should be kept secret, to be made available to the React application, which is going to be public. So in order to protect the environment variables, Gatsby will only pass through any environment variables that start with Gatsby underscore. So we'll add those in here. So these two variables now, environment variables, are going to be available to our React app. So if we copy this out, we can then replace the domain with process.env.gatsby auth0 domain, and we can replace the client ID with auth0 client ID. The redirect URI, so this is the URL or the URI that the user should be redirected back to after they've logged in to the hoist.auth0.com login page, the identity login page. We're basically going to redirect them back to wherever they came from. because the Auth0 provider applies to any component or part of the website, it also makes every endpoint a callback URL. The callback URL allows Auth0 to pass an auth code into your application, which the SDK will then take and exchange with Auth0 for an identity token. That auth code can now be intercepted at any point in the application, so we don't need a fixed, dedicated callback URL like you might have had to with different systems in the past. Let's jump back to the code over here and see where we're up to. So we've implemented the Gatsby version of the element wrapping mechanism here to provide the Auth0 provider to the application. We've also configured the domain ID and the client ID. So the next step here is a checkpoint. Let's test it out. So if we go back to the home page here, we need to start Gatsby again. If we hadn't been running Gatsby already, we would have to restart it at this point because Gatsby wouldn't have pulled in the environment variables. Now it has those environment variables. It's going to rebuild the React application, and we can reload that here. Okay, that's not working. That's because we forgot to remove this part here. So this is passed into the render method for the React application. We're doing the wrap root element for Gatsby here. We want to return just the Auth0 provider with the elements inside it. So we hit save, jump over, there we go. So we've got the page working again, which means that all of the configuration we've done so far works. But we haven't joined up the login buttons yet. So let's do that next. If we jump to the index page here, we can see the call to action buttons that we have here. And at the moment, they just call the alert method and pass in auth as a message. We want to instead call a login mechanism that's provided by the Auth0 SDK. To do that, we need to pull that in through the use Auth0 hook. We're going to be using the login with redirect method, which makes sure that we get redirected to the login page. There is also a login with pop-up. There are security implications and considerations either side. Login with redirect is always going to be more secure because the entire browser page is an Auth0 hosted login page, which means there's a lot more control over stopping cross-site injection attacks. Cookies and the like are HTTP only. So we're going to be using login with redirect. And we're going to call the use Auth0 hook. VS Code is automatically, once I type that in, pulled that in for us at the top there. If your IDE doesn't do that, don't forget to import the use Auth0 method from the hook from the SDK. And now we have access to this login with redirect method, which we'll simply paste into these points here. If we hit save now and come in and we click on login, we're redirected to the Hoist login page. Now, I already have an account. Under users and roles users, you can see a list of all users in your tenant. I have an account already that I've created previously, so I'm just going to log in with my saved details here, and we're redirected back to the homepage, and we're logged in. Of course, we can't tell that at the moment because nothing changes. First thing we'll want to do is to remove the login and sign up buttons because the user's already logged in, and we'll probably want to add a log out button in the top right hand corner there. In fact, what we'll do is we'll create a user navigation that provides the logout button, but if the user's logged out, we can have a login button there as well. That way, if we're on any of the other pages, there'll be a direct link to login. So let's have a look at these two buttons here first. Jumping back to the index page here, the call to action buttons we want to conditionally show based on whether or not the person is logged in or not. We could add some business logic inside the JSX here to determine whether or not to show this component, or this portion of the JSX. I don't like, personally, having conditional code inside JSX. I find it harder to read, and I find it easier for others to quickly be able to work out what's going on if it's separated out into components. So I'm going to cut this out here, and we're going to create a new component called CTA, or call to action. And because it's only going to be used on this page, I'm going to keep it in this document, and we'll define CTA here, and we want to return exactly what we had before. Now, the login with redirect isn't used within this component here now, so we can move this up into this method. And now the only thing that's changed in the index page here is that adding of the CTA component. We'll hit save, go back, buttons are still there. Great. It's still working as it was before. So now we need to define whether or not to show them in the first place. The useAuth0 hook here has a number of states and methods that it can have returned. We can see here there's a isAuthenticated, so that sounds like a useful one for us. So let's grab that one out. And we can now define that if the user is authenticated, we just want to return null. That is, we don't actually want to show anything at all. So if I hit save and jump back, the login buttons have now gone. But we can't log out. So now let's have a look at the navigation menu. We'll jump up here into header.js. And we have a navigation block here. And inside there we have an unordered list with our two menu items, home and about. What we want to do is create a second list. I don't want to put list items in here and then have to, in CSS later, float some of the list items one way or the other. We'll create a whole separate list of user navigation items. But again, because we want to have conditions around what's shown, I'm going to break that out into a separate component. So we'll define the user nav above in this document. Put that in here. And we want to return a single item use the right kind of brackets on return. There we go. Auto formatting is doing strange things all of a sudden. All right. So with the links, we actually need to use buttons. With the menu items, we need to use buttons. The reason for this is that we need to call JavaScript methods when people click on these elements. A link element or a standard anchor element or an A tag will require additional information. Link requires 2. It also does a whole lot of funky stuff around changing state and content without actually doing a redirect. A standard anchor requires an href, so we're going to use a button because a button by itself can have an on-click handler, and that's all it needs to have as a minimum. So let's change this to a button. And we want it to be a logout button. Because this menu item is never actually going to be active, if you click on logout, you redirect it and it says login. If you click on login, you're redirected to a login page. You'll never see that item actually active, so we don't need the active class name. 2 is invalid for a button, but we do want onClick in here. And onClick, we're going to call a method for logging out, which we need to get a handle on. So we're going to use the useAuth0 hook again. And in here we can see that there are a number of methods we have access to. Logout is one of them. Login with redirect is the one we're using already in the other page. We're going to need that one as well. So let's just grab that and put it in here. And we need to know whether or not the user is logged in or not. It is authenticated. So the logout button here on click, we're going to call logout. And if we hit save now, that's fine. We've just got a couple of warnings because I'm not using isAuthenticated or login yet. We'll get there. We now have a logout button here. I do have a style that I created earlier, so I'm just going to apply that. This is basically a style I defined to remove as much of the formatting from buttons as possible so I can style them more easily later. So we now have a logout button. And if we click on that, it'll take us to the home page again, and we've got our login buttons in all places. It still says logout though, so we need to add the business logic around that. So at this point here, we want to say if the user is authenticated, then we want to return the logout button. If the user is not authenticated, then we'll still be in this method, so we can just do another return at this point here. And we want to return, let's copy this. We want to return the login button instead, and we'll do a login with redirect. So if we hit save now, we now have a login button instead of the logout button. If we click on login, we're asked to log in again, so we can do that. And then once we're logged in, we see that it says logout, and we see these buttons here have disappeared. Okay, we're getting there. If I do a refresh of this now, I mentioned before that the link element in React and Gatsby allows us to change the URL and to change the content without actually doing a browser refresh. If I actually do a browser refresh though, and you have a look at the top here where it says logout, and you keep an eye on where the buttons used to be, we're currently logged in. When I hit refresh, these buttons appear, and the logout button temporarily shows up as a login button. The reason for this is that when the page is refreshed from scratch, the application doesn't know the state of whether or not the user is logged in, so it defaults to assume that the user is not logged in. Then it checks to see whether it's logged in by looking at a local flag. And if the flag says, yes, the user is logged in, then it needs to go to the Auth0 service to say, hey, can I grab an identity token to find out who's logged in? And then it looks at the identity token to make sure it's valid. And if all of these things line up, then is authenticated changes to true. Up until that point, is authenticated is false. What we can do is we can use yet another flag available from the use Auth0 hook called isLoading. And if it's loading, then we can't rely on the state of is authenticated at that point. So let's grab this one here and we'll pull that in as well. So at the moment we're returning the login button, unless the user is authenticated, in which case we're returning the logout button. But if it's still loading, we just want to return null. So let's hit save on that and see what happens. You can see the logout button here. If I do a force refresh, there's no button now until it knows the state, and then it says logout. We still need to fix this on the home page here though, so let's do the same thing for the home page. We'll jump back into index.js here and we'll say is loading. And now we can say if it's loading or the user is authenticated, then show nothing. Refreshing this page here now, we'll see that nothing shows up immediately because we're loading. And then once loading is finished and we know they're authenticated, it still doesn't show up. We log out now, we should immediately see the buttons appear again, and a hard refresh immediately shows us those buttons because that flag in local storage or a cookie that the Auth0 library manages has told us that the user is not logged in. The final part of today's session is to add a new page for account information. The idea with this one is that you shouldn't even be able to see the page if you're not logged in. We have conditional information here depending on the state of the user being logged in or not logged in, but this new page should only be accessible to people who are logged in. We'll have the menu item available all the time, but if somebody clicks on it and they're not logged in, they'll be redirected to log in. Let's do that. Jumping back into the header and down into the main header here, I'm going to duplicate one of these links and we're going to point it to account. Hit save and we get our account button. And now we just need to create that new page. So we'll create a new file, account.js. Now we need to import React from React. We need to define account. We're going to return, for now, just a header so that we can see what's happening. We want to wrap that in the layout though. And then we just need to export that at the bottom. Export default account. If I hit save now and we jump, oh, there was an error. Layout is not defined. So it hasn't been automatically imported because I was messing around and didn't type it properly. I could type in myself at the top here, import layout from the layout component, or I can just hit Control Space here, and you'll see that if I hit enter on the right, it says it's going to auto import it for us. If I do that, we can now see that this line has been added for us. So I'll hit save. I've added an extra T in there. Hit save again. Success. So we now have an account page, and when we click on there, we see our header. Great. So what can we do to secure this endpoint to make sure that the user who's accessing it is still logged in? Previously, we would have had to write some wrapper or helper code to detect the status of whether or not the user was logged in and redirect them if they weren't. The new SDK provides some helpers around this for us, which aren't actually in the Quick Start guide, but they are in the online documentation, which is at auth0.github.io/auth0-react. I'll put links to these down in the comments. This is the fuller documentation that gives us more information about the useAuth0 hook as well. But if we search this page for Gatsby, we can see that down here under this information about protecting a root, there is a method that we can pull in from the Auth0 React library called withAuthenticationRequired. So if we grab this, in the account page, we add that in here, we can then simply wrap the account block here with the withAuthenticationRequired, hit save. Now when I jump back here, you'll see we can see the login page. The reason for that is we were on the accounts page. When I hit save, React reloaded, and then it said, hey, I need to be authenticated. Let's just jump back to the application and do that from the beginning so we can see the process actually in action. So we're on the home page here, we're not logged in, we click on account, and it redirects us to the login page. So now when we log in, we're redirected back to the home page. So there's a little bit of extra information in here that is of use to us. So I mentioned before, we jump back to the Gatsby browser here. I mentioned before that there's this redirect URI that will send you back to the page you came from. With Gatsby, it still sends you to the home page. It doesn't actually send you to the account page. This would work in React, but it doesn't in Gatsby. With Gatsby, we need to override the onRedirect callback. This is a callback that happens when the user gets back to your application. We know there's a callback that happens, but we then need to handle it. The default way of handling it for React is not going to work for Gatsby. So we'll just grab this code here, and we'll put that into our Gatsby browser file, and we'll then define that in our Auth0 provider. Let's have a look and see what this does. When the Auth0 SDK redirects users to the login page because the page has authentication required, it includes in there a value of the URL that it should return to. If that value is not available, then it's going to default to still going to the home page. And we use Gatsby's navigate method to make sure that the navigation happens cleanly, that the URL changes and the content changes without an actual refresh. Now we need to pull that in, so I'm going to use the control space trick again to auto import that from Gatsby. That's essentially just added this line into the top here. So if we save this now and jump back to our application, if we log out, we'll be taken back to the home page. And then when we log back in again by clicking on the account button, we're redirected back to the account page. Let's have a look at what comes back in the identity token now for a logged in user. So we'll edit the account page again, and we'll add a bit of more information in here. So we want to print out the information that we have on the user, and we're just going to format it for easier reading on the screen. But we need to pull that user in. Again, this comes from the useAuth0 hook. So we define user from useAuth0. If we hit save now and jump back here, we can see the information that comes back in the JSON web token of the identity token for the user that's just logged in. We have the name, which is derived from my email address. The nickname is assumed as being the first part before the @ There's a link to my Gravatar picture, and we have down here a subject. At some point in future sessions, we're going to be looking at integrating with other software as a service providers, and we might need to have some kind of link in the data we store with them about the users that are using our system. In this case, we can use a subject. This subject will be the same every single time I log in. Even if I change my email address or my password, as long as this account is logging in to Hoist through the Hoist tenant, this is the subject we'll get back. So we can rely on that as being a unique identifier of my account here. So there we have it. We've integrated the new Auth0 Gatsby SDK within the Hoist application. We've created an account page that can only be accessed once you're logged in. We've created a login and logout mechanism that updates the home page accurately based on whether or not the user is logged in. The only thing that's left to do is to check our changes in. So if we jump over, I'm just going to say added Auth0 Gatsby, if I can type, SDK. And we'll just hit save and say, yes, I want to commit all the changes. And we're done. Thanks for joining me. See you in the next one. Hey, are you a web developer? Do you care about security and privacy? Are you interested in the Internet of Things? And what about videography and streaming? Well, these are just some of the things that I talk about on my channel. There's a couple of videos over here that you might be interested in, but until next time, thanks for joining me and have fun.